Welcome, everyone. Today we're sitting down with Ioannis Ioannou, who's Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the London Business School. I'm Marjella. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Datamaran, leading solution for external risk management, including ESG topics. Ioannis made it his mission to look at if modern businesses really contribute to creating that sustainable future we all want and need. Beyond being a very well-known and well-regarded academic in the field of corporate sustainability and sustainable finance, he's also a well-known and well-regarded thought leader in this space, often quoted by the FT, Bloomberg, BBC, and a very active member and thought leader of the larger community that is pushing for responsible business at large. I believe I'm correct when I say that it's Ioannis' personal mission to find evidence for what constitutes a responsible organization. And today we will be talking about the extent to which Ioannis believes that has been achieved and what is required in order to get there. He is also responsible for the course Sustainability, Leadership and Corporate Responsibility at the London Business School, a very popular course that is attended by many people all over the world and is offered online. So maybe we should start with that. What is this course about, and what are you trying to achieve and communicate through this course to your participants, Ioannis?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for having me today and this wonderful and humbling introduction. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to sit down with you and explore these very fascinating, challenging, and of course, fast evolving issues. So let me quickly address your first question. I think this course, which we call Sustainability, Leadership and Corporate Responsibility, it's a 6-week online course where basically my objective was to put all the knowledge, the experience, and of course the academic work that I have done to date into a consistent narrative that is basically geared towards mid and senior executives. The idea is to take someone that knows, that believes, that has an understanding that sustainability is important and tries to build a foundation by looking at the big questions in this space. For instance, why is sustainability important now? What is the business case for sustainability? Moving beyond the business case and asking what are the mechanisms through which sustainability can create value for companies? And it concludes with this larger organizational structure or organizational design question, which is how do we build organizations that are future fit and therefore able to meet the future sustainability challenges? This is the idea of how do we incorporate into the corporate DNA sustainability and social responsibility. And I'm very glad, of course, that we are working together with Datamaran, offering our participants the chance to learn what you guys are doing, the kinds of tools and frameworks and data that you very pioneeringly have developed in this space. Because one of the issues that we explore in this course is also the intersection of AI, ESG, sustainability, materiality, or even dynamic materiality, all of the issues that you are working on as well. So that's in a nutshell what this course is about.
Fantastic, Ioannis. I'm curious to hear a bit more about your perspective on integration of ESG or corporate sustainability into corporate DNA. I think, having been a participant in this field myself for the past 15 years, we've always talked about companies being on a journey. And personally, at some point, I felt we're stuck in the journey. There's a disconnect between what the sustainability professionals in a company are doing versus what is really going on in the management team or even at the board level. I think what we're seeing right now is that COVID-19, the current crisis, is actually making a stronger case for the importance of ESG and in that sense also making the boardroom directly responsible for non-financial risks. So what would you say to companies that, realizing now that non-financial risks, ESG, corporate sustainability, or whatever term you want to use to talk about these new risks and opportunities facing business, what would you advise companies that realize that it's important now, but might not have the infrastructure nor the leadership or the management in place to really tackle it? Well, how do you start, and what is required in order to be seen as authentic in the space?
Yeah, I think you bring up some very, very important issues there. I think, first of all, as I always tell my students across the board, I profoundly think that in general, sustainability is the mother of all disruptions. We often talk about other things like big data, AI, and so on as the big disruptions, but I do think that the environmental, social, and broader governance issues that the sustainability movement is bringing at center stage, these really do have the potential, and they are already fundamentally changing the global competitive landscape. And I think this is precisely what we're seeing with the COVID-19 crisis. It's not that these issues were not important before. Of course they were important. But what this crisis is doing is basically awakening us to how these risks can play out, the interdependencies, the global interdependencies in the supply chains, and the fact that we can no longer look at these issues in a compartmentalized way. They are clearly core strategic issues, but also they interrelate to each other. Clearly, climate change, health, and employee safety, for instance, are not independent issues, but in fact, they all form part of what one would call a responsible business. So that's point number one. I think point number two is that, as you were mentioning, companies are at different stages of the journey. And I think when we look at the real world, there's a diversity in terms of how companies are responding. Clearly, we have companies that, unfortunately, they are still at the stage where they don't care. And that's, rather unfortunate for them, because what do we know about disruptions? We know that at the end of any disruption, or even during a disruption, a lot of companies are wiped out. They're being replaced. Why? Because disruptions change the landscape, and therefore, if you do not adapt as a company, then you're no longer a good fit for the new marketplace. Now, think about the sustainability space, emerging issues related to purpose, values, the fact that new generations are looking for employers and companies that are authentic in their purpose, that make the world a better place, and therefore align with their personal values and their personal objectives in life. Look at this same generation entering the product and services market and demanding that the products and services that they buy meet high environmental and ethical standards. And even these generations, especially if we talk about millennials, we know that in the next 10 years or so, there's going to be a huge intergenerational transfer of wealth. So these guys are also going to be the investors that are going to demand the integration of environmental and social and governance issues. So the pressures from companies are coming across the board from all of their stakeholders, and therefore it's important to at least get on this journey. So beyond those, of course, that don't care, as we just described, there's others that experiment with what I would call the low-hanging fruit, eco-efficiency measures, experimenting with environmental management systems, for instance, and so on. And what we see over time, though, is that a lot of companies are moving beyond the low-hanging fruit because those are enticing. You see, oh well, look, I can actually have a large positive impact on my bottom line, even with these small initiatives. Why don't I take the next step? Why don't I try to innovate? Why do I try to rather than just be at the, what everyone else is doing, in other words, just do the common best practice, why don't I take a step further and try to lead my industry? Right? And we've seen this before. And it's important for companies as they try to integrate these strategies to understand that they evolve over time. Yes, of course, it was pioneering 20 years ago to say that you're going to go net zero. But if you announce that today, you're almost already behind. I mean, everyone else, even oil and gas companies try to become net zero these days. So it's important as we take this strategic decision making to understand how our industry is evolving and in fact, how the underlying stakeholder demands and expectations are evolving. And the third point and the last point I wanted to make to address your question is that we also now know, in addition to looking at these value creation mechanisms and kind of understanding them vis-a-vis where the industry strands of these issues. And remember, the industry issues, of course, reflect the materiality of the underlying issues, which is different across industries and across contexts. We also know that companies put in place what we would call the structural element. They start thinking about integrating into the corporate governance, into the broader stakeholder engagement practices, into the time horizon of their decision making. In other words, start thinking more long term, and that's also reflected in their investor base. That's typically characterized by more long term institutional investors, for instance. And finally, is the pillar of transparency and accountability. In other words, what type of disclosures do companies put out there? How credible are they in the ESG space? Do they report according to voluntary standards? Do they understand materiality? Do they report according to materiality? And how willing are they to assume responsibility beyond the walls of their own operations? And this is another emerging issue, a very important issue, because in some industries, we hear about all these net zero commitments, but if you read the fine print, that refers to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is typically the smallest percentage of a company's emissions. The big elephant in the room here is, of course, scope 3 emissions, and not too many companies go there in their net zero commitments, right? So, which means they don't dare go into the carbon emissions of their customers or suppliers, for instance. So those are sort of the pillars, if you like, step number 3 in terms of how companies can also structurally embed that commitment to sustainability.
Yeah, and I was excited to hear from you earlier, Ioannis, that in the online course that you do, this time around, you have more participants from the C-suite and from boards than ever before. So I think that shows us that there's a real, demand and hunger for this kind of information and knowledge, and maybe the understanding that these topics now belong in those areas. You talked earlier about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. These kinds of definitions, I think, are familiar territory for those that have worked for a long time in this field and call themselves ESG or sustainability technical experts. What is the gap between the knowledge that exists between people in the boardroom, on the management teams, and these technical experts? How can that be bridged? And where ultimately does the responsibility lie in your view of getting it right? I think there's going to be a lot of new kind of collaboration required between those that have this skill set and this type of knowledge, and then the need for education in the boardroom as well as in the management team at the appropriate level. How do you see that come together, and will your course also aim to bridge that gap?
You're absolutely right. So there's no question that these issues are being, let's say, elevated to boardroom discussions. It's almost inevitable, right? And we see that through the various surveys. For instance, if you think about the 2020 survey that the World Economic Forum did this year in terms of the top risks for business, right? After a long time, I think all their top 5 or even top 10, if I recall correctly, risks were related to climate change. So there's no question that, if anything, the COVID-19 crisis has made those risks much more visible. So there's no question in my mind that these issues are entering boardrooms. Now, as you rightly pointed out, though, there is a gap. And I think there are many reasons for that gap. First of all, sometimes it's just simple lack of knowledge, right? People don't perhaps, we know that for years we have funding of climate change denial, for instance, especially if you see countries like the United States. So there's no question that there is either lack of knowledge or sometimes an ideological opposition, right, to these to issues of sustainability and social responsibility. The old sort of debate between, you know, what Milton Friedman said about the role of the corporation, how we've been educating MBAs for years, that, you know, you have to serve the supreme being, which we're going to call shareholder, and then everything else follows from there, which clearly has left us with a system that's highly problematic. It has created huge environmental degradation, inequalities across the world, and so on. So I think those issues are inevitably coming into center stage. They're being exaggerated by the COVID-19 crisis, and therefore inevitably, I think they're going to enter the language of the boardroom. I think here we should highlight the fact that the capital markets, the investor community, is certainly bringing these issues to the forefront, especially for those, in this case, asset managers that are becoming more activists, either with direct engagement or even passive managers that started to use their vote to raise their voice. And in fact, even asset owners are putting now pressure on asset managers to deal with these issues, because especially if you're an institutional investor, for instance, you really need to look at the long term, if you're a pension fund, for instance. So I think those conversations in the boardroom are also the result of pressure that's coming from the capital markets. Mm-hmm. Clearly, one of the, as you mentioned, one of the major motivations that why we launched this course is to exactly target that group, because, you know, there's a number of courses out there that are more technical in their training, right? Let me show you how to report according to the GRI or SASB and all that. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, it's a good thing to do, but if you're a senior executive, I mean, first and foremost, you need to really understand the strategic implications of this. You need to understand, well, what is this idea of stakeholders? How do I understand what's happening in my industry? How do I measure that? How do I understand the difference between, you know, metrics that may be entirely irrelevant and immaterial from my industry versus those that are material? And the other, key point here is that executives need to also be on top of these issues. This is not just the once a year financial reporting that you do. These issues are so much, the ESG issues that is, they're so much fast evolving that create, in my opinion, a need to be, to constantly monitor these issues. Because a lot of these issues are what we would call emerging out of social preferences. Let me give you an example. You know, one could argue that, unfortunately, right, let's say 10, 15 years ago, you know, the world did not particularly care about gender pay equality. And that was the sad truth. But now these issues have bubbled up. We, of course, as we do profoundly care about how companies pay their employees and if they discriminate against women. So for the knowledgeable, the very considering sort of investor, these issues should be monitored so that, you know, in advance almost, or as they bubble up through social preferences. And the final thing perhaps I should note there is that what I've seen in my experience is that, you know, there is lack of diversity in the boardroom, and that's a fact of life. Gender diversity or all sorts of other diversities. We do know that boardrooms are dominated by the old white male. And you can even see that at trustee boards of pension funds, for instance. I've been on conversations where we try to talk about a more sustainable and inclusive world, and you hear people that actually sit on these boards that say, I'm not going to make a value judgment about what a better world means, which I find shocking, right? I mean, okay, we have some difference in what a better world means, but I hope we can agree that, you know, not exceeding the planetary boundaries and leading the whole planet to an existential cliff should count as a better world, right? Under anyone's definition. But we still have those ideologies, I think, and those sometimes entrenched and vested interests to battle. And let's not forget, we live in a world in which companies have funded climate change denial. We live in a world in which companies are buying out politicians, and we call it lobbying. And we live in a world in which, you know, companies knew about lung cancer caused by tobacco and they did not disclose it. So we should be acutely aware about the realities on the ground, and that these are the kinds of impediments, if you like, that perhaps through more education, more engagement, and in fact, more pressure and more regulation for transparency, we'll hopefully be able to overcome.
Yeah, I think the element of transparency is really key there, right? In terms of being able to build trust and trust the company, and in terms of being confident that the company is moving in the right direction. So when you think about concepts like, you know, sustainability reporting versus annual reporting, the materiality analysis, a risk management process, all things that will be disclosed or should be disclosed in these annual reporting efforts. What are those things you are looking for when you read those disclosures that give you the confidence to say, I actually feel that this is a company that is on the right track, that is taking these areas seriously, that really understand what the material risks and opportunities are to the business that we talk about more broadly as ESG? How can you, as an external stakeholder, find evidence into that? And I'm just curious from your standpoint, if you go through these documents, what are you looking for? What are the green flags? What are the red flags?
Well, that's a fantastic question. So let me start with the broader idea of transparency. I think that generally as society and as institutions, we have a long way to go because we're lacking some of the basics here. For instance, of course, companies should disclose their lobbying efforts. We need, especially in countries like the United States, where, you know, after the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court and therefore the full intervention of money into politics, we need to know what sort of activities and what sort of lobbying are companies doing. For instance, it's extremely useful to know that some automakers in the US were lobbying the US government in the midst of COVID-19 to relax environmental laws and regulations, for instance. That's very important. Second of all, things like industry associations. We know that a lot of, for some companies, even leading companies, right, their own commitments to ESG are at odds with what these trade associations do, and even though they're members. So we have seen in recent years some of them abandoning some of these trade associations, but we need full transparency on that. And the last one, of course, the biggest elephant in the room is tax. Companies disclosing on you know, what sort of tax are they paying, which jurisdictions, where are they registered, and essentially, you know, we get a window into how much tax avoidance there is out there. So that at the broad level, I think is very critical to keep in mind that we are lacking sufficient laws, regulations globally and nationally, that, as I'm sure you know from your experience at the GRI as well, to get at those big issues. Now, when we go on the corporate side, I think there's clearly, again, variation in the quality of the underlying, of the disclosures. I'm very encouraged when companies decide to adopt voluntary standards, things like the GRI, SASB, TCFD, and so on. I think that's a basic step, but an important step, because some of these disclosures clearly are not, you know, adhering to particular standards clearly entails a cost and perhaps a deeper understanding. But I think that what raises, let's say, green flag for me is when I see reports or disclosures that are closer to an integrated or a holistic understanding of the business. In other words, you as a company can convincingly explain to me how the ESG issues or the management of those intangibles integrates or interrelates with your core narrative, how you make money, how you produce the value that you're producing. And hopefully, in the best of cases, you can convincingly explain to me how you do that in a synergistic manner. In other words, your social performance enhances your financial performance and vice versa, because that's what we mean by future fit organizations, in my view. Red flags, unfortunately, and I have to say this, reports with many pictures, plenty of marketing narrative that lack numbers to back up the arguments a lot of the times, a complete distinction between here's our financials, here's the rest. All those are, for me, certainly red flags. But on that point, and I also want to note that, yes, we can see the reports, but, you know, as the layman of reading these reports, clearly that's not enough. I think we need two more components in order to assess. First of all, it's a more dynamic understanding of the issues. In other words, see, you know, how this particular company compares with what the industry is doing, or what this particular company has been doing in the last 10 years. Are they improving? Are they understanding the issues better, and so on? So we need, in other words, several benchmarks and a more sophisticated way. And I think that's precisely the kind of tools that Datamaran has in terms of using these text analysis and deep learning technologies to help us make sense of these disclosures, and not just the disclosures, but also everything that's in the public domain is very critical. So that's one of the components beyond the report. And the second one, I would argue, which I think many of the sophisticated investors do, is, as with every investment, direct engagement with companies. Literally speaking with the management team to understand beyond what's on paper, how authentic, how real is this commitment? What is the mindset? What's the mind frame of the company? Because you really, as I always say to my students as well, sustainability is both about the mind and the heart, right? It's not just about the numbers. It's not just about the balance sheets, or even the environmental profit and loss balance sheets and so on. It's also understanding the personal motivation, the purpose, the vision, the drive, the passion, if you like, of the people that are leading the organization to really try to assess the level of their commitment.
Fantastic. I think that's a great summary of you know where we are, but also what needs to happen going forward. You touched upon the role of data there as well. You know, having credible data there in order to inform decision making, and that was indeed, I guess, that was to the heart of why we started Datamaran in the first place. Because whenever we would reach out to the C-suite or boards, they would say, what data do you have to back up that this stuff is getting more real, right? And that was a real challenge. So for certain people, you can convince them with a strong story as to why this is what the world needs, and be passionate and explain why the world is changing, and that certain companies will, as you say, be future fit and others will not. Other parts of the business will say, you know what, I am working on, I have my risk process here, my risk management process here. I'm working on my annual reporting process. This is business as usual for me. In order for me to make sense of these new risks and opportunities that exist, I need data, and I need data that can fit with what I'm doing already. So I think that's been one of the challenges that we've made into our challenge, to see how we could help bridge that gap there. I think we're getting close to the end of our podcast, Ioannis. I've again learned a lot, and I'm thinking maybe there is just one final call to action you would want to put out there to our audience that has been listening in, summarizing the discussion, but also, you know, since we're currently in this COVID-19 crisis, what is it that you think business professionals should keep in mind, you know, while working from home, in terms of this new reality that is out there? What is your call to action to the business world from your angle?
So I'm optimistic that there will be, hopefully there already is, a silver lining to this horrible crisis. And that's to open our eyes and our consciousness and our awareness that issues like climate change and all those other issues that We know about everything from deforestation, the acidification of oceans, to social issues, modern slavery, poverty, inequality, and so on. All those are crises that in my own, and of course what the scientists are telling us, these are going to be crises that are, if we allow them to happen, they're going to be much worse than the current crisis. So I'm hoping that the silver lining that we see from this crisis is, first of all, the role of science and data and how much more trust we need to put in them, hopefully undermining those years of, fight against science. Second of all, really understanding that government is not the enemy. Yes, there will be corrupt, inefficient, ineffective governments across the world, but there is a very useful role for government in terms of regulation and in terms of scaling up effective solutions. So for instance, yes, companies can and do solve problems and scale things up, but at the end of the day, only the government can tell you stay at home, because we need to stop this virus. So that scaling up of solutions, I think, is going to be essential in some ways to deal with the climate crisis. So the call for action here is for corporate leaders to really understand that these trends are here, not only here to stay, but they're here to accelerate. I think we're fundamentally going into a world that's going to look much more different, especially if you start thinking about things like sustainable cities, the future of transportation, right? All of those big, the future of mobility, all of those, the future of travel, all of these big chapters that have huge implications about the ESG issues. So it's fundamental, I think, for business leaders today to have a honest discussion with their stakeholders in their industry, understand what are the demands and expectations, project how these trends are likely to affect their business generating potential, and start investing in solutions and collaborations, whether those are collaborations at the level of the industry or to be unafraid to pursue collaborations with other actors like governments, like social activists, like NGOs, because we are all in this together. No one actor alone can solve these large issues that are coming, and therefore we need this new level, if you like, of collaboration. So the sooner those investments start, the better it's going to be, not just for the companies and the industries themselves, but indeed for all of us.
Thank you, Ioannis. I think what's become very clear to me today is that all these issues are interconnected, and therefore it requires a very connected approach within the company, where your annual report, your risk management process, what's happening at the board level, the tone at the top, the way in which the managers speak, it all needs to be connected and integrated, right? And then the importance of collaboration, the collaboration between governments, the collaboration between corporations. It can only happen in an accelerated way when all those things line up. I think promising is also the role of the media there. I think recently we've seen the creation of moral money within the FT, Bloomberg Green. So also the media is really paying more attention to how corporations are presenting themselves. So my takeaway from this call is I think never let a good crisis go to waste.
As Paul Romer said, yes, absolutely.
Exactly. Credit where credit is due. Talking about collaboration, I'm very much looking forward to our collaboration on your course. I think that was a very good example how one can be creative at a time of crisis where in-person meetings cannot occur. So thank you for allowing us to participate in that. Thank you for joining us on the Datamaran podcast today. And good luck with all the great efforts that you have underway, and wish you great success in that.
Thank you very much for having me. As always, it's a pleasure and a privilege. I look forward to our collaboration as well. And as always, staying in touch as the issues are evolving and returning back to these discussions as again, issues are evolving and becoming more and more important going forward. So thanks again for having me.
You're welcome.